Okay, I'm going to show you now a little more flexibility that we have with our ecosystems for creating scenes that you might not have thought of, or putting it to use where you might not have thought it possible. And one thing I'm going to do just to start out is just add in a plane. And I'm going to go ahead and scale that up just a bit and move it down. And what I actually want to do to this is I'm going to apply an ecosystem of objects. And I think the best thing for this would be to actually add an airplane. So I'm going to go into our material by double clicking on that preview up there and going to check ecosystem under type, making sure that we're in the advanced material editor and not the basic material editor. Go to ecosystems and under our general tab, I'm going to click add object. And I'm just going to select one of our little presets that we already have in here. You can grab any one of these number of planes, or of course if you have any of your own objects, you can grab those as well. And I'm just going to click OK and let that load into our scene. And right away, before I do anything, I'm going to click populate and see what it looks like. Well, now we have all of these airplanes kind of flying around each other, but they're all different sizes, and we can't really do too much with that because it doesn't look very realistic. They wouldn't all be different sizes, and of course they're falling into each other and crashing into each other, unless that's what you're looking for. But we can make some changes here. We're going to go to scaling and orientation, and I'm going to change our maximum size variation to 0 and click populate, and now we'll notice that all of our planes are exactly the same size. But we still have a few other problems, pretty much the direction. So what I want to do is change our rotation down to 0 and hit populate again. And now we have all of our planes facing the same direction. And we can do kind of a neat little scene where we have our planes flying all together. But if you still notice, they're still kind of crashing into each other. So let's say we want to add a little bit of spacing in there. What we could do is pretty much keep them from hitting each other and go to density and avoid overlapping instances, which is located under overall density, and hit populate. And now we have a group of airplanes that none of them are touching each other. They're nice, far spaced apart. And I'm going to click OK. Now we have all these airplanes in the scene. There's only one problem. We still have it attached to this plane. And of course, if we're underneath the planes, we're going to see that. And of course, even with the material and lighting, it will show up too. So the easiest way to actually get rid of that is to double click on our surface for our plane, and we're going to go to the General tab and double click on our underlying material, which is going to give us the option to edit that plane. And all we really have to do is increase our transparency to 100% and make sure our fading out is set to clear. And I can click OK and OK again. And now we will lose that plane completely. Not the planes, but the two-dimensional plane that we have in there, creating our ecosystem. So now if we want to create a nice little scene with a bunch of planes flying over, you don't have to duplicate a bunch of planes. We can actually use an ecosystem to control where these planes are facing and how many there are. We could scale them down a bit, increase the density, make the plane a little bit larger, the two-dimensional plane, and repopulate that, and that way we'll get a lot more airplanes. What we can also do is go ahead and copy this. So I can hit Control C and Control V, copy and paste, and we can bring up another layer. And now we have some more planes in there, and I can just move that off to the side, hit paste again. So we have one more, bring that up a little bit higher, off to the side. And now we kind of have a cool little scene where we have a bunch of airplanes in the sky, and we can use these ecosystems to control them. And just by making our object that we use to create the ecosystem transparent, we don't have to worry about it getting in the way. So I'm going to do a quick render here now. Just render that to the screen so you can take a look at the scene and how it really looks. Go ahead and click render and just let that go. So we can take a look now at our completed render and see that it looks pretty neat, and we have all of our airplanes sort of flying in uniform with each other, although there's a bit of variation, and Because of actually this plane, uh, the propellers in front are actually appear to be animated, or they have that sort of look as if they're moving. So you don't really have to worry about animating the propeller, because of course with this method you would not be able to animate planes individually. If you wanted to have a couple of planes doing different things, or having all the planes kind of tilt back and forth on their own separately from the other planes, then of course you would have to go through and actually create each individual plane and animate it, or at least one main animation, then sort of copy that and kind of alter it a little bit for each object. But this is still a pretty quick, easy way to create a neat scene. And of course, you don't have to use airplanes. You can use whatever you want. Uh, but it's a good example, especially with airplanes, to show you we could just remove that plane and we could raise it up in the air. So if you didn't think about even doing this method at all, this is a good way to do it. And there's also a few other things you could do with it too. Let's say we wanted to have our planes so they're not all level with each other. Well, what we could actually do then is use terrains to define our ecosystem. So let's just go ahead and do that really quick. And I'm just going to delete these objects we have right now. And because it doesn't have a name, let me delete it. There we go. And what I want to do now is just create a standard terrain. And we're going to use this to create our ecosystem, which is going to give us a level of altitude difference for each plane. We'll raise this up, and we're going to double click and go back into our ecosystem, just like we did before. Add an object, and we'll select that plane again. And now I can hit populate. And as you can see, they're still all kind of jumbled like they were before, so we have to go back and change our settings. Avoid overlapping instances, going to scaling and orientation, and 0 on the maximum size variation. And actually, there was one more thing. We need to make sure that we change our rotation to 0 and hit populate. And before I do anything else, I'm going to go to the General tab and double click on our underlying material. Go to Transparency 100%, making sure that it's clear, and click OK. And OK again. And now if we take a look at our scene, we can see that we have different altitudes for each of these planes, and we can vary that up a little bit more instead of constraining it to a sort of flat plane. So you can do this with terrains, planes, whatever you want, spheres, any object, to create these shapes for your airplanes. And now we have a level of altitude that's pretty neat, and we don't have to worry about them interfering at all. And it does look a little more realistic if you have bits of elevation in there. And then, of course, you could once again copy and paste this, or even copy paste, edit the terrain, and hit populate. So if we wanted to have another layer of these, but don't want the exact same shape, formation, and altitude of our planes, I'll just copy and paste it and pull it up. And what we can do is double click on our new terrain that we have, the copied one, and just go ahead and edit this a little. So it's a little bit different than the one we have right now. And I'll just raise it up on the side over here where it wasn't raised up before. We can get some airplanes in there. And what we're pretty much doing is just adjusting our altitude by adjusting the altitude in our terrain. I'll click OK. And now because we edited the terrain, we have to repopulate our material. So we'll double click on that material, hit populate, and click OK. And now we have different terrain featuring different levels of altitude for our airplanes, which makes it even more realistic because that way it's not the exact same thing over and over. So if we went underneath this and kind of looked up, we would see something pretty neat. I'll just go ahead and render that really quick. And with our completed render, now we can see that it's a lot more realistic than what we had with the planes, just because we have so many altitude variations now. And even with the terrains, with added sort of a tilt to some of the planes, which adds a little more realism because they wouldn't be flying perfectly straight. So that's a pretty neat little method you can do. But there's also more you can do with it. Let's say we want to define an actual formation. And we'll use these airplanes once again as sort of an example. But what we can do is use terrain to actually define uh, a shape. And I'm going to double click on this terrain and actually um, pull this up just a bit. So we're cropping out the bottom. And what we can do is paint in exactly where we want our planes to be. And what I'm going to do is just kind of raise this up. And now, of course, you can also do this with image maps and create your terrain. But if you actually want to do it within view, this is a great method to do that. And we'll also be showing you how to do this with objects. And we can actually create a metablob object to do the same sort of effect. But I'm just laying out sort of a pattern that birds fly in. And I'm going to crop out from the top and crop out from the bottom. And it will leave us with this shape that we have right here. And of course we could define that a little bit more if we wanted to, and go in and make pretty much any shape that we wanted. And click OK. And now what we also need to do is redefine our ecosystem. So we're going to go ahead and populate and click OK. And now if we take a look, we can see our formation. But actually, because of the way our airplanes are tilted, you'll see they're actually coming at the camera right now instead of flying off to the right, which they should be. And actually their images in here are a little bit off, and they show them going both ways, and in the top view they're actually facing the wrong direction, which can kind of throw you off a little bit. But all we really have to do is rotate this terrain, and we can repopulate. Or of course we could redesign the object if we wanted to be facing the correct direction, because if we rotate it, it might not work out correctly. So I'm going to rotate that and hit repopulate, or just populate, and we'll take a look and see where our planes are facing. And they seem to be facing in the correct direction now. So now we've created a formation where we have sort of that duck formation or bird formation and sort of that V shape. But it still doesn't look a little perfect, or that perfect. So what we could actually do is go in and define the terrain even more if we wanted to make a very thin terrain, a very thin shape. So we only have so many objects per area. But we could also increase the size of those objects. So we'll increase the scale to 1.3, hit populate. And now they fill it in a little bit better. But they still not be maybe exactly where you want them. So you can go in and define that. And like I said, with any shape, because you're not confined to specific shapes, you can do pretty much whatever you want. And by using this clipping method, we're able to create a flat plane, and we can really define that area. And of course, you don't have to crop out the top either. If you want to add that little bit of elevation in there, we could raise that up a bit and then dig out those areas, making our brush a little bit smaller, and sort of pull that down, not going too far. We want to give ourselves a little bit of leeway here. But we can just go in there and edit it like we did with our other terrain, changing the elevation so that we have different amounts of altitude for each of our planes. And what we could also do, like I said, is create something that you normally wouldn't see. We can increase our size or our flow and lower our softness, and just go in here and create a different type of formation. We can click OK, and then we'll repopulate, or just hit populate. And now we have our planes all in that formation that we just created. So you're not just confined by traditional shapes. You can of course do anything that you want with it. And of course you don't even have to use airplanes. This is just the method I chose to show you because it seems to be a very practical use for it. Now let's say we have a scene where we can't use a terrain to sort of define that area, or you just don't want to, and you want to have maybe a little bit more control over the shape of your object. What we can actually do then is use shapes to sort of define these areas. And what I'm going to do is just grab in, let's grab a cylinder, and we'll squish that down and move that off to the side and add a box. And we can move this around, scale that out, and it doesn't have to be perfectly flat or perfectly even, just as long as we get the overall shape. And what I can do then is go in and just start creating our objects. This would give us an area of elevation in there if we wanted to do that. Or we could go back and add in our cylinder and kind of keep with where we're going here. And just define these areas and create these interesting shapes that we want to define an ecosystem with. And like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be airplanes. We'll use trees in this case. I'm going to go in and add another object over here. And this is just something that maybe if you didn't want to use an image map or you want to do it within view, because it's easier to sort of lay out, like let's say you have your major scene already pretty much done, but you know an area that you really want to define trees in, but you don't really want to have to edit too much, so you want to go in and define specific areas that you want those trees. What we could do is one of the easiest ways is just to take all these objects and group them together. And then with that group, we can assign a material to the group, which will be an ecosystem, and we could just add a plant. We'll just go in here and add a tree. We'll grab that umbrella tree and hit populate. And because of our scale, we'll have to scale that down a little bit. But now we have our trees only being created on these objects, and we can sort of define that area. And then what we could do is, like we did before, if you don't want those objects to show up, just go ahead and go to your underlying material and, of course, increase the transparency to 100% and bring the clear down to bring it all the way to clear when it comes to fading out. And that way we can have just some floating trees in there. But we can use this to define lots of different objects, and you could even turn this into a meta blob if you wanted to. Because let's say you have a very, very dense terrain or a very dense ecosystem. So if I edit the material and we bring our scale down to, let's type in 0.05 and hit populate and click OK. And now we have these very harsh edges of where our trees are being populated. So if we didn't want that sort of look to it, what we could do is create a meta blob out of those objects instead of just grouping them. And that way we can round off our edges and even define a little bit more how rounded we want it to be. So it's not so unrealistic, unless of course you're actually trying to create shapes, which you could do some pretty neat landscaping things with that. So that's also another use for it. I mean, especially if you're doing sort of architectural visualizations where you want to work on the landscaping with a very defined detail, and you want to give your client a very accurate representation, this is a good way of doing that. And of course, like I said, we could do it with terrains too, and you could even define certain parts of the terrains where you want your ecosystem to be. And that's if you don't want to be using image maps, because I prefer image maps. But if you're actually in a scene and you want to be more interactive with that image map, it's probably one of the best ways. And I'm going to go ahead and just ungroup this object now, and I'm going to create that meta blob out of it. And that way we get those rounded edges, but of course we still need to populate. Click OK. And now we have our more realistic looking ecosystem because we have this nice blend in between the objects and not that harsh cutoff that we had before. So this is a lot more realistic way of doing it. And of course you could add more objects in and out as you wanted to. You could just ungroup the meta